All right. Welcome to the second episode of the Orange Wheel podcast, the podcast that helps business leaders navigate the monetary transition. We want to be mindful of your time and energy, so we are keeping this episode strictly to 21 minutes. My name is Johannes. I am the co-founder of Orange Wheel, and with me is Ted, founder and CEO.
Glad to be back.
All right, Ted. So today we're going to talk about why advanced nations still lack when it comes to Bitcoin, considering they're so innovative in other areas. If we go, so why do you think Scandinavian corporate leaders have this issue right now, or are not paying attention to Bitcoin yet?
Yeah, I mean, it's a really interesting discussion that I think a lot about, given that I'm not a native European or native Scandinavian, but I've lived over 10 years in Denmark and Norway combined. And I think there's kind of two steps to adopting Bitcoin, whether you be a corporation or a retail investor or a institution. And there's kind of the why and then the how. So in the case of Bitcoin adoption, the why is really based on what is the strategic rationale, what is it that I'm really putting my economic energy into, and why should I do it? And then the how is more of the jurisdictional specific elements in terms of legal, regulatory restrictions, accounting requirements, tax implications, and so forth. So I think for today, I think you and I decided we're going to focus on the why piece for this podcast, and in a future podcast, we'll focus a bit more on the legal, regulatory, tax implications and those types of barriers. But then to answer that question, I think it's really fascinating. It's a bit of a paradox within Scandinavia. They are at the kind of forefront of payments technology. They have a very, quite well functioning system when it comes to how their financial system operates. There is effectively universal access. So in short, I think it's just that the need isn't as apparent as it is in other jurisdictions. The inflation rate is noticeable, but not devastating. The payments technology works very well. So people just don't see, I think, fundamentally a need. And then I think we go into a bit more into the, morality and economic orthodox perspectives. And we'll kind of dive a bit into that with some slides. But given that you're actually Scandinavian, Johannes, what would you agree with that kind of take, or do you see things a bit differently?
We woke up really early, right? So how much is it? If we just get an overview now, is it 6 companies in Scandinavia that has adopted a Bitcoin treasury within the last couple of months? I think it's 3 in Sweden. There's just 1 this week, and then 3 in Norway as well. So we are still really early on this, like Bitcoiners used to say. I guess in Scandinavia, like you were saying, we have this. So our fiat currency is probably one of the best. I think Norway has one of the best currencies currently, with the lowest inflation and purchasing power decrease. Like there's other areas in the world where if you have problems with your fiat currencies, take Asia. People trying to send money back home to Asia is really difficult. So that's a good way for people to learn about Bitcoin. So we don't really have that aspect in Denmark or in Scandinavia where we are in need of learning about it yet. Time might come. I think so. Yeah. It's funny because Scandinavia, we have 2. So Norway and Sweden have adopted a Bitcoin treasury. It's kind of like in Denmark, it's proof of neighbor. So our neighbors have adopted it in Sweden, Norway, but in Denmark, we're still lagging behind. So that's going to be really exciting to see what's going to happen.
And maybe it's worth mentioning that those are publicly traded companies which have to release that information as to whether or not they are putting Bitcoin on their balance sheet. So the number of total companies, if you include private companies, is certainly higher in all Scandinavian countries. And I was talking with guys from Relay when I was at BTC Prague last week, and they were saying that in fact they have a half dozen clients that are small businesses in Denmark that are putting Bitcoin on their balance sheet. They're using it as a reserve asset. So I think there is more adoption than one might imagine. but it is, as you said, still very, very small in the grand scheme of things, and really, really early still.
Yeah. Okay, so Ted, let's try and talk about some myth that people and corporations might have about Bitcoin in Scandinavia.
Yeah. So with that, I'll just share a slide very quickly here. Yeah. So I think in general, people have been coming up with hundreds of criticisms of why Bitcoin is bad or doesn't make sense or will fail or will be taken over by something else or, dot, 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 fill in the blank. And I think the proof is in the actual real price performance of the asset class. And the truth is 16 years, and it's only getting stronger and stronger effectively every year, with some very few exceptions. But overall, the direction of travel is that it is accumulating more economic energy. More economic actors are deciding to place an increasing share of their economic energy into Bitcoin. So despite all of the fears and concerns and criticisms, it continues to prove otherwise. I think that's the most important thing to kind of mention. And with every year that passes, those naysayers' credibility, I see it decreasing, right? Then we get to kind of specific arguments. And there's a plethora of different arguments, whether they be technical in nature or whether they be economic or moral in nature. And at least my experiences in Scandinavia, when I talk to people, is that it tends to be more on the morality side. So fairness and the ethics of Bitcoin. And then if people get over that hurdle, then it tends to be on the fact that it is antithetical to the orthodox economic theory that people have been sort of taught in school. So I'll just spend maybe a minute on each of these categories. So the bad for environment and society, one that's very popular today, or has been very popular, is the bad for the environment piece. So the fact that Bitcoin mining does use energy, and that some of that energy does result in emissions. What we're seeing as time goes on is that the argumentation is actually showing that yes, Bitcoin consumes energy, but it also enables the development and build out of renewable sources, also at locations that would not otherwise have been able to afford those investments. So we're seeing, especially in Africa, the ability for small communities to get local decentralized energy sources using renewable power sources that they wouldn't have otherwise been able to afford, because now they have this additional revenue stream coming in, whether it's them personally or Bitcoin mining companies that are doing that. And statistical analysis is showing that the carbon intensity of the Bitcoin network is decreasing tremendously over time. So this is one that's being, I think, consistently disproven. And I think what it ultimately fundamentally comes down to is that some people say, okay, fine, it might be decreasing carbon intensity, but actually ultimately energy should be used on something else. So usually it comes down to a more of a moral question. They just believe that Bitcoin is not good and therefore doesn't deserve energy. Well, whereas the existing financial structure, they don't posit the questions of how much energy is used in our existing financial architecture, because it's believed fundamentally to be a good use of energy. The analogy I tend to bring across is, refrigeration. Nobody goes out saying, stop putting energy in refrigeration, all the emissions with refrigerants and all the energy going into that, because people think refrigeration is a good thing. It makes their lives better. So I think the environmental, I think, is a bit more. It's becoming increasingly just a veil. I think it's underneath the veil is really this question of, is it really a good thing for society? Then the second category that I tend to see is this idea that it's just a tulip bubble. There's no real use case. There's no value, whether it be intrinsic or extrinsic. And it's really just about speculation. This is just, there's too much liquidity in the system. People are going to find speculative things to invest in or gamble on. And this, again, points to a lack of understanding of what Bitcoin really is. It's not even an investment per se, although we do see the price going up over time as measured in fiat terms as it monetizes. But really, this is a new money, a new technological form of money that is superior to the old system. And it provides that function, the ability for people to store and transmit their economic energy that they've developed through the labor and time that they've put into their work, whatever that may be. And again, in countries like the US, Canada, Europe, where the fiat currency is not devaluing at a rate that's too obvious, when it's typically 2 to 5%, people find that that's okay and doable, and they'll instead, preserve their wealth in other asset classes like bonds, stocks, real estate, and that's sufficient for them. Not optimal, but sufficient. And then the third category here or third one under the bad for environment society is just this more catch-all of the fact that this is something that is not good for humanity, that it is used by nefarious criminals, that it is unfairly distributed, that it really only helps the people who are already in. And again, the data is consistently showing that actually the proportion of nefarious transactions happening on Bitcoin is less than that on the existing fiat system. It's more traceable and recordable. If you wanted to get away with doing money laundering, you would not do it on the Bitcoin network, because your identity is, the documentation is there. There's a paper trail, and it's immutable. Whereas cash, it's much easier to get away with that. And then on the fair just distribution, this is actually the only asset class that is universally accessible to anybody who has a mobile phone and a connection to the internet, right? Whereas most of our conventional services and assets are highly restricted. Banking is something that many people in the developing world don't have. And then you look at asset classes like hedge funds, venture capital, even real estate to a certain extent. It's very limited the number of people who can invest in these asset classes that provide extraordinary returns. In effect, it's really the people who are already wealthy that are able to access those classes, whereas Bitcoin is something that's available to everybody, and anyone who puts their economic energy into the network empowers everybody in that network. So it's a really fair, egalitarian, and communal monetary system, especially when it's compared to the system we kind of have today. And then, if I may, just spend a few more minutes now on the economic side of things. So, a bunch of my friends here well, I'm in Canada now, but my friends in Denmark, they're economists by training. And what I find with them is if you can get past the moral and ethical and environmental arguments, it'll come down to saying, well, now it's a threat to our economic orthodoxy. We will expect that, what we've been taught is we need to control the money supply to be able to prevent recessions, to maintain economic stability. And I would argue, and I think it's becoming more and more apparent, that by manipulating the money supply, it's actually maybe deferring small recessions, but it's creating more frequent, large economic crises and financial crises. And that's exactly what we've been seeing since, most evidently 2008 with the great financial crisis, the bailouts that then had to go in afterwards, all the liquidity that had to get injected, which is effectively just taking economic energy from everybody within the system by devaluing by creating more monetary units. And we have this rise of zombie companies. We don't have these small recessions that would typically kind of wash out the unproductive investments in sectors within the economy. And so these things just persist and become a greater and greater lag on the economy, a greater and greater burden to carry forward. More and more debt that is effectively underwater, but being kept up through liquidity injections, which just make this kind of kicking the can down the road over time, but ultimately leading to a potentially disastrous long-term outcome. And then the last one is this idea that currency devaluation is a good thing, and that if prices were to fall and wages were to fall, then psychologically people would not be able to get over this idea that they'd be earning less Bitcoin year over year, even if that purchasing power of Bitcoin is increasing. And I think that's just a psychological thing, a mind shift change that can happen in the society as long as people realize that their purchasing power is actually growing over time. That's what I think people will care about, not whether the number in their account is getting bigger and bigger. So that's kind of the key arguments I've seen in my experiences in Scandinavia. What are your thoughts, Johannes? Do you see things similarly, or do you also have different ideas?
You found like the people you've been talking to at least have done some research, right? Because what we just delved into is like there's not that many people, your typical Joe wouldn't know about this stuff. So I think to begin with, the issue is just misinformation. And like you were saying before, we don't really we don't feel the need to take this step and actually try and learn about this stuff, why it actually works and why it's not as bad as other people or legacy media would say. But I agree with you in general. It is, and it's also like, how are we then gonna try and overcome this, right? So there's definitely some legwork here, just in general. I have a question for you, Ted. So let's say you are a Scandinavian board member, right, or a CFO, right now, listening into this conversation. What would you tell them, or what would you say would be the first thing or the best thing they should begin to learn about Bitcoin or take a look at?
Yeah, I mean, I think what's becoming really important, I think the way a lot of business leaders think is there's a bit of a herd mentality, looking at what others are doing and the performance that those strategies have resulted in. And the more time that goes by and the more companies that embrace Bitcoin or investors for that matter, and exceed the performance of those that do not, I think it'll be a natural consequence that at some point people are going to start asking, why are you not doing the thing that your competitor is that enables them to outperform you? We're starting to see this take hold. It's still early innings, but I think that's going to be the kind of game theory that plays out. I think from a technical standpoint, Bitcoin can be quite a lot to digest in terms of the actual way it works and the longer term implications that has. But I think within that space, it probably is worth people to really understand the fact that there is a limited supply, that there's a predefined supply curve that'll be generated over the next 120 years, and that's incorruptible. I think recognizing that there is really this finiteness is a complete shift on understanding the potential value and upside potential that Bitcoin could become if its full potential is realized.
Mm-hmm. This got me thinking, right? So I think everyone would agree that most Canadian countries is really socialistically leaning, and when you think about it this way, I mean, Bitcoin is essentially the most ethical currency ever. Like everyone has the opportunity to get into it. I know you were saying earlier that people are saying, well, it's because those who went in earlier, they're getting paid now. I think I read somewhere, I think it's like 60% of all Bitcoin is held by individuals right now. And if you try and compare that to gold or something else, right, it's like, no way, there's no chance. Yeah, I guess there's in general in Scandinavia, we just like I keep going back to what I was saying before. We just don't need it right now, but we do need it. But people need to take the extra step to actually begin to pay attention to it, right?
Yeah, and I think it's going to become I don't know what the word is, like you're not going to be able to continue arguing that you're just going to ignore it. I think business leaders will need to at least take a position on it. And that position might be, we just think it's a tulip bubble. We don't want to touch it. But those arguments, I think, are going to become increasingly unacceptable by other stakeholders within the organization, who would expect there to be at least some degree of, rigorous analysis into coming to that argument, as opposed to just saying it's our opinion because I saw it on the news, or because my friend told me that, or I heard somebody got scammed. So I think we're going to see the need for real argumentation and data to for business leaders to stand behind, and for asset managers, and for anybody who has stakeholders that they're beholden to, because the questions are going to start coming, and I think it's best that companies get ahead of that, as opposed to be caught flat-footed when those questions do come.
Yeah, I agree. It's really exciting. I think we're in a good time now, and it's going to be so fun to see what's going to happen over the next 5 to 10 years in this corporate Bitcoin space. Okay, Ted, we have reached the 21 minutes, so let's end it here.
Yeah, there's so much more I wanted to discuss here. I had more slides, but I guess they're going to have to wait for another episode. So
Yes.
the audience will have to stay tuned, I suppose, for some more great analysis. But thanks a lot for the conversation, Johannes.
All right, take care.
See you in the next one. Bye-bye.